Welcome to my Docker video. Today I'm going to try to get this Express application into a Docker container. So I have a pretty simple Express application. We just require Express, the body parser, and most of my code is in the routes. We just set up our server with a body parser, make sure we're using JSON, and we're going to have a API route that serves up all of our JSON. And then I just start up the server. So when it starts, it should say server has started. Now, one thing to note, in my package.json file, I have a nodemon set up. And nodemon will restart my server whenever I make changes. And this is really nice because sometimes you make changes and then you try out your API again and nothing changes. And you're wondering why not. And it could be just that you forgot to restart the Express server. Well, nodemon will automatically restart that. So we can see this in action down here. It says the server started. Whenever I make a change and save my file, you can see that it's restarting my server, so I know the changes have been picked up. So under this scripts tag in the package.json file, by adding this start in here, and make sure you add a comma after it if it's before any other scripts. This is the command that npm will run to start our server. So all I have to do to start the server is type npm start and the server starts. Now there's certainly other ways to do this. You could type nodemon as your command, but since we're going to Dockerize this, and if you're following along with this video, you might want to do it this way. That way your server starts the same way as mine. Or you'll just have to figure out how to get nodemon started some other way if you're starting nodemon on the command line or something like that. And another thing to note, you don't have to worry too much about what your Express app does at this point. You might even have MongoDB connected in here and a different way of starting it. But for now, we are just going to run a base app. And my app is really simple right now. It just has the test API endpoint that's just going to return a message that the test API is working. And I'll show that working on Postman. So I got Postman, and my server is running on port 3000. So I'm just going to go to localhost 3000, go to my API, and then I have my test API endpoint, and I'll just click send, and you can see that I get a message back that this is working. As you're developing, it's nice to have especially as you're moving from running on your local machine to a Docker container, it's nice to have some API that doesn't depend on Mongo or anything else that you can just test to see if your server's working. Now, if you are going to follow this tutorial exactly, you might need to disable the connection to your MongoDB database or whatever other database you use, because I'm not going to set that up right away. And if your app won't start until it connects to the database, then it's going to be hard to follow along with the steps. So what you can do is just comment out that connection. And this might be inside of a promise that you get back to launch your app after you established a connection. So you could just kind of copy that code, paste it out here, comment out your database connection. So now you're no longer connecting to a database, and you have a server that you can start. And then you can leave probably the rest of your API in there. We're just not going to use it. We're not going to test it. So if you tested it, it would probably fail because you don't have a database connection. And then you can just get a simple API endpoint that works so that you can test it out. Make sure you get your app working on your local host before you go to try to put it in a Docker machine. Another option is to leave it all together, just kind of watch the tutorial as you go along. And then when I add in the Mongo connection, then you can maybe pick up with the tutorial there and try to do it all in one step. Now the next thing you're going to need to do is install Docker Desktop on your local machine. If you're going to try to run these containers, you need a Docker desktop to run them. So just go to docker.com and go down and find the Docker desktop, download and install that machine. You'll probably need to create a Docker Hub account that will allow you to check out some of the community containers that you might use to be able to get Docker desktop running and log in to your Docker Hub account on your Docker desktop application. Once you got that all installed, we're ready to create our Docker container that's going to contain our Express API. One other thing before we get started is we will want to add data to our git ignore. This is where we're going to store a database, and we probably don't want to check that into our code repository. You should already have node modules in your git ignore as well, but if you don't, the way that you would add it in is step 1, move your node module folder to some other place. Then commit, add stage and commit, and then come back to your git ignore after you've committed and add the node modules in there. And then you can move your folder back, and then Git will start ignoring that folder. If you immediately add this in, it's not going to ignore it because you've already checked in node modules into your repository. So by moving it, staging and committing, you tell your repository that that folder no longer exists, and then you add it into your git ignore and it will ignore it as normal. So the next thing we want to do to be able to Dockerize our container is to create a Docker file. Now let's go through this node file line by line to tell you what it does. This first line tells us what image we want to use. They've already set up an image on Docker Hub that is a node image, and we're using the latest version. I believe I'm using node version 14 on my local machine. I'm not sure if the latest version has 14 on it yet, but everything should still work. Nothing in my app has any breaking changes using the latest version of Node. So the next thing we do is we create a place on in our container to store our application. So we just make a directory under user source app, and that's where inside of the container our application is going to live. The next thing we set is our working directory to be the same folder that we just created where our app is going to live. Now we need nodemon to run this, so we're going to install globally nodemon into our image. Next, we're going to copy our package.json file that has all of our dependencies in it. And we're going to copy that to where our app lives, and we're going to run npm install. Now, I'll come back to this file, but the next thing we want to do is create another file called docker ignore. So dot, and there has to be a period in front of it, docker ignore. Because there's some files that we don't want copied over there, and I have my node packages installed on my local machine, but we're going to have the Docker container or install the packages itself, and that might conflict with the packages on my own machine. So we don't want our node modules to get copied over into our Docker container. So we want to make sure that we ignore that in our Docker, and we might want to ignore the log as well. So this will make sure that that this node modules is not going to be copied from the local machine inside of the package. That way the Docker container can set up its own node modules. Now this next thing right here is going to mirror my folder on my local machine with all these files in it to where my app lives. And again, because of the Docker ignore, we're not going to mirror the node modules folder. This next step is exposes port 3000 because my Express app is running on port 3000, we need to open that up so that we can get to it from outside of the container. So if you're running your app on a different port, make sure you change this to the port that your Express app is running on. Finally, this just runs npm start that will start up our server. Now this is a guide I found on Node.js.org on how to build and run your Docker image. So this will build your image and this command will run it. Now this is great if we only have one image, but we're also going to have a database image and we might add something else like a front end or a static server image to our application. But and we want it really easy for new developers to hop on board. It would be nice if they could type just one command and it would build all of the images and just launch them all. And that's where Docker Compose comes in. So as you can see, Docker Compose is a tool for running multi-container Docker applications, which is what we're eventually going to do. So instead of building the images manually in Docker, which we could do, we're just going to jump right to Docker Compose, even though we just have one image so far. So we're going to add a Docker Compose file, and it's a YAML file. So make sure you do docker-compose.yml. Now this is what we want to put in our YAML file. If you don't know, YAML's another way of typing in JSON. It's not JSON, but everything you can do in JSON, you could kind of do in YAML. These little hyphens designate an array. You got the name value pairs. It's just without all the curly braces. Sometimes it's kind of a pain to put all the curly braces and everything in quotes, whereas YAML gets rid of that. So you might want to make sure that you have YAML installed in your code or your text editor so that it kind of guides you on how to format this. It is space sensitive, or it does syntactic white space, so you need to make sure you have the tabs in the right spot. But what this says is this is the version of Docker Compose we're using, and we have different services. Right now it's only one. We have a web service and it's in the current folder. Notice the Docker file and Docker Compose are in the same folder. This is the command used to start the server. This is going to make sure that we expose port 3000, and we're also going to map our current folder with our application. So once we get all that in our Docker file and we save it, we can run Docker Compose build. And that will build our image. Now this might take a little bit longer. You might have to download the image in the first place. But hopefully if you didn't have any typos in your Docker file or your Docker Compose file, or maybe even the Docker ignore file, you should see successfully built and some hash code, and also it will be tagged. By the way, it's tagged by the folder name that exists, that everything exists in, underscore, and the name of the service. So if you're looking for this image, make sure that's the image name that you use. Now we just need to run our image, and of course you got to make sure that Docker is running on your development machine, but you just do Docker Compose up. And this will run it up, and you can see that NodeMin has started our server, and we're getting the server has started. And we might want to check now if we make changes to our server that our server does restart. And that's a good test, so that now we know if we make changes, we don't have to restart our server. And that's just gives us a little peace of mind. If we're developing our app and we save our files, we don't have to remember to restart our server to make the changes take effect, and then we're testing it out and nothing is changing. And all we did was just forget to restart our server. NodeMin will always restart our server for us. Now if we ever want to stop our server, we can just press Control-C and that'll stop our server. And if we want to start it again, just Docker Compose up. Now, if you do edit your Docker file, you will have to run docker compose build again. But if you don't edit that and you're just changing your server, Control-C will stop your server from running, and then docker compose up will start it up again. So now that our Express server is Dockerized, we probably want a data store. So we're going to use Mongo for that. And I'm going to add another Docker image for to run our database. And we're just going to use the Mongo right here. One thing that I have to add to the web is say, hey, I depend on the Mongo image. And again, this name must match up with this name right here, so that this server knows that it depends on the Mongo database server as well. And so the Mongo is going to use the Mongo image. We're just going to use the default Mongo image. We're going to make sure we expose the default Mongo port. So we're going to take the port on the container, map it to the outside on a local machine to use the same port. This right here is going to map the folder called data right here to the database. So all of the data that our Mongo database saves is going to be saved in a folder on our local machine. Now this is great if we ever destroy our images and rebuild them. Our database doesn't get wiped out because all the data is being saved on our local machine, and that's what this volumes does. Now in my git ignore file, I am ignoring that data folder. We probably don't want to check our database into our code repository. It's a large file and we can easily rebuild it. Now, if you do want to seed it, you could check in a seed file to seed your database, but it's not a good idea to check in your database into your code repository. Now let's go ahead and make sure we build that Mongo image. So docker compose build will now build our Mongo image. Now that happened pretty quick for me because I've already downloaded the Mongo image, but you will probably have to wait for that image to download. And we can run it with docker compose up. And now you can see that our Node.js server is starting, and also our Mongo image is starting as well. So we got both of them starting. The only thing is they're not really connected together because my app doesn't have any Mongo code inside of it. I'm going to use Mongoose to manage my connection to the database, and I need to get that installed, so I'm going to do npm install mongoose and make sure I save it in my package.json file. You probably, or if you're doing an app that already had a connection, you might already have that in as one of your dependencies. So now that we got that installed back in here, I'm not going to launch my Node.js app until I made sure I've created a connection to the database. So I'm going to take all of this code and put it inside of a promise that gets called when my connection to the database has been established. Right now we do a mongoose.connect, and this is the URL that we need to use. Now you might need to modify this URL from before. Of course, you would want to use your database name instead of something else. So this is Acme database, and then we're going to use the new URL parser and use unified topology true. And let me see if I can get a little more space so we can see more of this on the screen at a time. And here is the promise coming back. As long as the connection is established, we'll call this function that will create our Express app and do what we did before and launch our server. So now we can run docker compose up again and make sure we've saved our changes in our index.js file. And when we run docker compose, we can see that NodeMon is waiting for our Mongo server to boot before it starts our server. And now we can see that our server has started as soon as our connection has been established. Now another thing to notice is that we now have this data folder inside of our application, and that's because our docker compose file mapped the Mongo database folder inside of the container to that folder in our application. So now if we ever destroy the Mongo image and rebuild it, we won't delete all the data with it. Now off camera, I've added a schema post, which just has a title and content. So I added a schema which is part of Mongoose, and this is kind of outside of this tutorial. This is more about how to throw it into Docker. I've added that in, and then in my routes.js file, I've added in all of the RESTful routes to be able to create a post, get all the posts back, get a single post back, update it, and delete it. So I've added those API endpoints into my routes file. So now I'm ready to test all of this working together. So using Postman, I'm going to go ahead and try to get all of the posts back. And you can see I don't have any posts yet, but that request coming back does show that I was successfully able to connect to my database and make a query. So now we have a Docker application, an Express or a Node.js app running Express in one container, and another container running our Mongo database, and the two containers are able to talk to each other and run on my machine. So once we add a new developer to this project, all they have to do is check out our source code repository, run docker compose build, docker compose up, and now they have their server up and running, and they can start editing the code and making changes. And as soon as we want to deploy this to production, all we have to do is push our changes out, and the Docker container should be able to get launched in production mode.